myself. David Pakman is a liberal propaganda. Oh, I want to watch that. I agree. And I used to watch David Pakman. All right, we're going to watch that. All right, we got to watch this. So I used to watch David Pakman. For those who don't know, he's basically a liberal. Like, he's one of those people where it's like he's in the new media sphere, right? He's considered like, he's similar to like Kyle Kalinske or whatever, these left-wing new media, or quote-unquote left-wing new media YouTube personalities. But he's like the closest you can get to MSNBC on YouTube, right? Like, he is a new media person. He mostly does his own stuff. I know he has like a producer, like people who help him out with the show or employees or whatever. So he's not like a giant corporation, right? He's still a YouTuber, which is, they refer to themselves as new media, or that's been the label. A lot of them are just social democrats, not a lot of communists. But he's very liberal. Like, I don't even know if I would consider him a social democrat at all. Like, he doesn't even have that many policies that aren't just neoliberal technocratic half measures. So I'm really excited to see that Hakim did a video on him, because I'm aware of who he is. And I used to watch his stuff. I actually recommended him to my dad once. So let's check this out.
One video kind of stood out to me. Why I'm Not a Socialist by David Pakman. Fine, not a Hello, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to all. Today I thought I'd make a fun little reaction video, and one video kind of stood out to me. Why I'm Not a Socialist by David Pakman. Fine, not a Mimi, PragerU,
I want mommy, I want milk, I want to be held, I want to be comforted
video, but educational nonetheless. I'm unfamiliar with him, but this seems like the fabled social democratic theory spoken of only in legends, so...
Interesting. Hakim is unfamiliar with him, and I am familiar with David Pakman, so maybe I'll be able to add some stuff. Who knows?
Let's take a look and have some fun. Slight preface, no hate towards this guy. I've just been sent this video a lot, so why not, I thought. Otherwise, like I said...
Yeah, I don't think he's a bad guy either, Pakman. He seems like a good dude, just like a lib.
That I'm not really familiar with his political positions, let's say. Anyway, so he starts off by defining that he's a social democrat and is for a socially guided market economy. Nothing too weird here. Let's see what else he has to say.
What's your position, David? And I've mentioned before that I'm not a socialist. I'm a social democrat in the sort of Nordic or Swedish tradition. And today I'm going to explain to you why I am not a socialist. And I'm happy to do this. It's something that's been an area of study.
Is it because you love imperialism, David? Is it because you want to live with the spoils of imperialism like the Nordic countries you love so much? Is that what it is, David?
For me, since undergraduate and even including in graduate school.
This is something that stood out to me immediately. I've been studying this for around half a decade and still not evolved past the most basic social democrat talking points. He seems to show an incomplete understanding as to why social democracies currently exist, and even further ignorance as to what currently sustains them.
Fundamentally, I'm not a socialist because I want an egalitarian, free, self-determining society. And that type of society will not emerge from authoritarian apparatus.
An egalitarian, free, self-determining society. Capitalism doesn't provide that, Habibi. Historically, it was the threat of socialist revolution that pushed egalitarian principles and political agendas to the forefront. The nonsense authority point is as wrong as it is boring at this point. Capitalism is an inherently authoritarian system. Getting kicked out of your job and being forced to be homeless on the street because you missed a rent payment or had a medical bill you couldn't pay apparently isn't authoritarian. Regardless,
I had somebody send me a video or an article today. I guess this is being pushed by U.S. media that Chinese soccer players or football players are not going to be allowed to have tattoos, that the government was banning tattoos, and I was looking into it, and it looks like it's not true. You know, the U.S. media took a press release from some sports agency in China and extrapolated these conclusions. You know, there wasn't like a hard and fast rule that came out in China banning tattoos. But, you know, I pointed out to my friend who sent me that, I'm like, there are so many jobs in the U.S. that don't let you have tattoos, that make you cover up your tattoos or won't hire you if you have a tattoo in a spot that shows. Like, how is that not authoritarian? And then he literally said, like, well, in the U.S. that's private companies, and in China it's the government. And I'm like, so only the government can be authoritarian? Like, just because it's the government and not private companies running your life, it's okay? And he was like, I guess that makes sense.
He probably would rebut, but social democracies have protective nets against these sort of things. Well, that's true in part, but where do you think the wealth for all that came from? Don't you think authoritarian means were used to secure the resources that allow for those safety nets? Firstly, many beacons...
Was it authoritarian for Denmark and Norway to stop Cuba and Venezuela's COVID payments from going through so those countries could get the vaccine? The Nordic countries allowed like 90% of the payments from Venezuela and Cuba for the vaccine to go through, and then blocked the last 10% of like these $100,000 whatever $1 million transactions, so they could prevent these countries from getting the vaccine. You know, even though apparently the U.S. embargo on Venezuela and Cuba doesn't affect medical supplies, according to the State Department and liberals. Is that not authoritarian? Is it not authoritarian to starve people so you can continue exploiting their country for cheap resources? Like, that seems pretty authoritarian from the Nordic countries.
Of social democracy, like Britain and France, were massive imperial powers that built their wealth on the destruction of indigenous industry, colonial taxes, and the direct theft of the areas and peoples they've subjugated. Secondly, even those countries, like Norway, that didn't have direct empire still exploit the imperial periphery via unequal exchange and value transference. Companies in social democratic countries still take advantage of cheap immigrant labor at home and cheap imperial periphery labor abroad. They still rely on market preference via IMF restructuring of the ruled economies that puts the core in advantage over the periphery. This is something made beautifully clear in the works of Zach Cope, John Smith, and Tinsuandi, and others, which I cannot recommend enough. Regardless, social democracy basically advocates for, rather than stripping the bourgeoisie of their unearned privilege and stolen wealth, we instead grovel at their feet for small concessions that they'll regally laud over you as some great self-sacrificing favor, despite the fact that workers, much like yourself, were the originators of all that wealth that's providing for those concessions in the first place.
So Hakim gives the good Marxist analysis of we can't, workers create all the value, so why would we, grovel at the feet of capitalists? Which is a great point. And, the major failure of social democrats or people who are against political revolution and socialism, their main failure is believing that we can convince the bourgeoisie to give up their wealth, right, or to stop seeking profits. And this is something Marx understood, that capitalists become personifications of their own capital, right, because their businesses are their livelihoods, and if they don't continue to make more and more and more and more profit, their business would go under. They are going to continue to do whatever they need to do to continue to make more and more profit, which is exploit workers as much as possible. So it's a giant game to maximize exploitation between the capitalists, and there's no way that they're going to put their own morality ahead of their own profits. It's just never going to happen. So this idea that we need to grovel at their feet and beg them to give us free healthcare, like, there's a reason that hasn't been working. There's a reason the last 40 years in the U.S. and the U.K., the governments have been dismantling social reforms, right, and social welfare programs. It is because we aren't organized as workers, right? It's because they're not giving us these things out of the goodness of their heart. They are things that need to be fought for. When FDR was president, there were like 1 million card-carrying communists in the U.S. or some ridiculous number like that. They were threatening to actually take power as workers, and that's how they got some reforms. So, social democrats incessantly believe that, the morality of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalists, will eventually, encourage them to give us health care or whatever else. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. We need to threaten to take power and actually build organs of worker power to fight the bourgeoisie, not to beg them for healthcare and education.
And what that means is that at the national level, socialist and communist structures are fundamentally authoritarian. And at scale, enacting socialism or communism...
Fundamentally authoritarian. Think about that. Those two words. Fundamentally authoritarian. What does that even mean? When I think of fundamentally authoritarian, I think of like capitalism, like a system where every single person is working all day and the surplus value of what they create is going to a handful of people who don't work, and then those people who don't work also control the media and the government and everything. That is the most fundamentally authoritarian system I could possibly think of, other than the slavery, which this current authoritarian system was built on. So I don't know what he means by they're fundamentally authoritarian. Like, they fundamentally require authority? Yes. Like every society does. And, every change of societal structures in history has come from a clash and a battle over authority, right? So it's just a question of who has the authority. Is it the workers or the capitalists? And right now they have all of it. So I guess maybe it is fundamentally authoritarian, as in all societies are fundamentally authoritarian, and it's just a matter of which class has the authority.
Are fundamentally authoritarian, and at scale, enacting socialism or communism becomes authoritarian.
Repeating the same point, basically. It's a tired centrism. When the capitalist class does whatever it has to do in order to secure its wealth, power, and privilege, that's just how life is. But when a working class government does the same, it's all of a sudden authoritarian. Rules for thee, not for me, yada yada. If you're interested in a deeper dive into this, I made a video concerning authoritarianism you can check out here. Just know, authoritarianism is a two-way street. Socialists are just honest enough to admit that political aims may require authoritarian means, whatever those may be. Those that support capitalism also understand this. They just cover it up with sophistry and ideology in a limp attempt at seeming more respectable and reasonable, despite presiding over a system that has historically, as well as in the modern day, been far more barbaric than anything that's preceded it. Behind every nice-seeming social democrat is a neoliberal, or even worse, a fascist, why am I saying the same thing 3 times, that will bomb, murder, interfere, sabotage, and destroy in order to secure higher profits against the backdrop of token outrage from the oh-so-reasonable social democrats.
And probably the best example of that is Rosa Luxemburg, one of the greatest communist theorists of all time, great activist in the Soviet Union, was killed by collaborating fascists and social democrats, which largely was a huge blow to the socialist struggle in Germany. And of course, if Germany would have gone socialist at the same time that the USSR did, that would have been amazing for human history. Would have avoided a lot of horrible things like World War II.
Vietnam, Iraq, Grenada, history is my witness. Take a look at the works, late Victorian Holocausts, The Triumph of Evil, Killing Hope, or honestly any book on modern imperialism to see for yourself. Or hell, even Michael Parenti's Against Empire. Very highly recommended.
And a top example is Venezuela.
And here's why you shouldn't listen to what this guy has to say, by and large. Habibi.
Alright, I gotta head out soon, but let's finish this part about Venezuela.
Venezuela is a social democratic country. They have made no serious attempts at surpassing capitalism, challenging the market, or even destroying the power of the capitalist class. There is no central plan. The working class doesn't hold sole political power. Private property hasn't been abolished. There is still wage labor. I can go on. I don't know how many times this needs to be said, but socialism isn't when the government does stuff, nor is it when a party has a socialist in the name. At the beginning of the video, he seems to understand this distinction, but when it comes to actual material realities, he's completely off the mark. Pakman's contention seems to boil down to not why I'm not a socialist, but more to why I prefer the social democracies of white.
Yeah, how does he point to the Nordic countries and then say Venezuela is the reason that socialism fails? So it's like Venezuela, as Hakim said, is very similar to a social democratic country. They've renationalized their oil company, kicked U.S. private interests out of their oil company, and then used the revenue from their nationalized oil to fund social programs, basically. And there are probably more efforts to build socialism in Venezuela than what Hakim was describing. Like, there are these workers' councils, and there are like 7,000 or so communes where workers sort of make the productive decisions and they get funding and support from the government. But basically, they're a social democracy. It's just rather than getting to trade with the U.S. like the Nordic countries do, Venezuela's under 166 economic sanctions. So how could you look at them and say, oh, that shows how socialism fails, but the Nordic countries are good? No, that shows what would happen if one of the Nordic countries were under an embargo. If the U.S. surrounded one of the Nordic countries with their military and started siphoning or not letting them trade and blocking them off from trading with the rest of the world, the Nordic countries would look probably worse than Venezuela. So, interesting video there. Unfortunately, I have to head